On the morning of November 3rd, 1944, a Douglas C-47 Skytrain designated as transport aircraft 4293847 departed from RAF Barkston Heath in Lincolnshire, England, carrying medical supplies bound for a forward airfield in liberated France. The aircraft never reached its destination. At 0947 hours, ground control lost radio contact. The C-47 disappeared from tracking logs. No distress signal was transmitted. No wreckage was reported. The crew, pilot Captain James Holloway, co-pilot Lieutenant Bernard Fisher, navigator Lieutenant David Marek, and radio operator Staff Sergeant Emil Kovac, were listed as missing in action. Search operations were conducted for 72 hours across a corridor spanning the English Channel and northern France. No trace of the aircraft was found. 6 days later, on November 9th, the same C-47 landed at an emergency strip near Reims. The aircraft was intact. The crew was alive. The medical supplies were still on board, untouched. What was not intact was the aircraft's radio equipment. The transceiver had been disassembled and rebuilt into a configuration that violated every technical specification in the Army Air Force's communication manual. Components from emergency survival radios had been cannibalized and spliced into the main system. Wiring had been rerouted through the aircraft's intercom circuitry. The direction-finding antenna had been removed entirely and replaced with a jury-rigged array, constructed from aluminum struts salvaged from cargo netting frames. The modification rendered the C-47 incapable of standard communication with Allied ground control. It also rendered the aircraft capable of something else entirely. The post-flight interrogation report, filed by Captain Holloway and declassified in 1979, described the 6 missing days in language that oscillated between technical precision and barely suppressed disbelief. The report stated that on November 3rd, approximately 40 minutes after departure, the C-47 was intercepted by a formation of 8 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters operating out of an unidentified Luftwaffe base near the Franco-Belgian border. The fighters closed to attack range. Standard evasion protocols were attempted and failed. The C-47, a lumbering transport aircraft with a maximum speed of 230 miles per hour, could not outrun fighters capable of 400. The crew prepared for engagement. They had no defensive armament. They had no fighter escort. They had no chance. And then Staff Sergeant Emil Kovac asked the captain for permission to try something insane. Kovac was 23 years old. He had been born in Budapest and emigrated to the United States in 1937. He spoke 4 languages fluently. He had worked as a radio technician for a commercial broadcasting station in Cleveland before enlisting in 1942. His technical proficiency scores were the highest in his training class. His psychological evaluation noted unconventional problem-solving approaches and resistance to procedural constraints. He had been reprimanded twice for unauthorized modifications to communication equipment. He had also been credited with repairing 6 radios that other technicians had declared irreparable. His service record described him as brilliant, arrogant, and impossible to supervise. Captain Holloway's report stated that Kovac had requested access to the aircraft's radio equipment and 30 minutes of uninterrupted work time. He stated that the German fighters were closing fast and that standard options had been exhausted. He stated that he granted Kovac permission because there was nothing left to lose. What followed was described in the report as the most reckless and technically incomprehensible act of improvised electronic warfare witnessed during the European air campaign. Kovac dismantled the C-47's radio system while the aircraft was under pursuit. He rerouted power from the emergency battery bank directly into the transmitter, bypassing voltage regulation circuits. He reconfigured the frequency modulation controls to broadcast across the entire Luftwaffe tactical communication band simultaneously. He removed the microphone from the intercom system and connected it to the transmitter's input stage, creating a feedback loop that amplified ambient cockpit noise, engine roar, hydraulic hum, wind vibration, and broadcast it at maximum power across every frequency the German fighters were using to coordinate their attack. The result was a wall of noise so dense and so disruptive that the Bf 1009 pilots lost all radio communication with each other and with their ground controller. The German formation broke apart. The fighters scattered. The C-47 descended into low-altitude cloud cover and disappeared. By the time the Luftwaffe pilots restored communication and regrouped, the transport aircraft was gone. Kovács's modification had worked. It had also destroyed the C-47's radio system beyond any possibility of repair, with the tools and materials available on board. The aircraft was now flying blind, unable to transmit or receive, unable to navigate using radio beacons, unable to call for assistance or identify itself to Allied air defenses. Captain Holloway made the decision to continue the mission using dead reckoning navigation. For 6 days, the C-47 flew at low altitude, avoiding radar detection, landing at night in fields and clearings to refuel from cached supply dumps, evading both German patrols and Allied forces who might mistake the radio-silent aircraft for an enemy transport. When they finally reached Reims on November 9th, the aircraft was immediately grounded. The crew was debriefed separately. The radio equipment was examined by signals intelligence officers who described it as a catastrophic violation of approved communication protocols and an improvised electronic countermeasure of unknown effectiveness and unrepeatable design. Emil Kovács was placed under formal investigation for destruction of military property, unauthorized modification of assigned equipment, and conduct endangering the safety of his crew. The investigation remained open for 9 months. It was closed without resolution in August 1945, 2 weeks after the war in the Pacific ended. Kovács was discharged with an honorable service record and no formal commendation. The report on his actions was classified. The modified radio equipment was disassembled and stored in a signals intelligence archive in Virginia. No one spoke about it publicly until 1979, when Captain Holloway, dying of lung cancer in a veterans hospital in Oregon, requested that the declassification process begin. Holloway died 3 weeks before the report was released. In his final statement, recorded by a military historian, he said, "Emil saved our lives with a radio he built in 30 minutes while we were being chased by 8 German fighters. He did it without permission, without a manual, and without any certainty that it would work. He was the best radio operator I ever flew with. And the military never recognized him, because recognizing him would have meant admitting that he broke every rule we had." The investigation into Emil Kovács's actions began on November 10, 1944, less than 24 hours after the C-47 landed at Reims. The lead investigator was Major Peter Whitmore, a signals officer with an engineering degree from Cornell and a reputation for procedural rigor. Whitmore's initial report described the modified radio system as an unsafe, unreliable and unauthorized deviation from established communication protocols that endangered the crew and compromised operational security. The report recommended disciplinary action ranging from reduction in rank to court-martial. It did not recommend commendation. It did not acknowledge that the modification had worked. The technical analysis of the equipment was conducted by Lieutenant Samuel Drucker, a civilian engineer who'd been drafted into the Army Signal Corps in 1943. Drucker had worked for RCA before the war and had designed commercial broadcast transmitters. His evaluation of Kovács's modification was more ambivalent. He confirmed that the configuration was unsafe. The power overload could have caused a fire or electrical failure. He confirmed that it was unreliable, the feedback loop was unstable and could have collapsed at any moment. He also confirmed that it was effective. The signal output, measured from the salvaged components, exceeded the broadcast power of the standard SCR-287 transceiver by a factor of 7. The frequency spread covered the entire range used by Luftwaffe tactical communication nets. The noise pattern, characterized by Drucker as chaotic and phase incoherent, would have made intelligible communication impossible for any receiver tuned to those frequencies. Drucker's report included a technical addendum that was not circulated beyond the signal's intelligence division. In it, he stated, "The modification demonstrates an intuitive understanding of radio frequency propagation and interference dynamics that exceeds the training provided to Army radio operators." The operator responsible for this work possesses knowledge equivalent to that of a civilian broadcast engineer with 5 to 10 years of professional experience. His ability to improvise a jamming system under combat conditions suggests potential applications in electronic warfare that have not been formally explored by Allied signals intelligence. The addendum was ignored. Major Whitmore's recommendation for disciplinary action proceeded through the chain of command. It reached the desk of Colonel Raymond Briggs, commanding officer of the 437th Troop Carrier Group, on November 18th. Briggs reviewed the file. He reviewed the technical reports. He also reviewed the mission logs for November 3rd, which showed that no other Allied aircraft in the vicinity of the C-47's last known position had reported contact with Luftwaffe fighters that day. The German formation that had intercepted the transport had apparently broken off its attack and returned to base without engaging any other targets. Briggs requested a classified briefing from RAF intelligence on Luftwaffe activity in the sector during the first week of November. The briefing, delivered on November 22nd, revealed that German radio intercepts from November 3rd included multiple reports of communication disruption and unknown jamming source filed by Bf-109 pilots operating out of an airfield near Liège. The intercepts described the jamming as localized and mobile, originating from an unidentified aircraft that disappeared before a second interception attempt could be organized. The Luftwaffe had attributed the incident to a possible Allied electronic warfare test and had issued a tactical advisory to all units in the region to maintain radio silence when engaging unescorted transport aircraft. The advisory remained in effect for 2 weeks, during which time Allied transport losses in the sector dropped by 41% compared to the previous month. Colonel Briggs read the intercepts. He read the technical reports. He read Major Whitmore's recommendation for court-martial. Then he filed a counter-recommendation stating that Staff Sergeant Kovacs had demonstrated exceptional initiative and technical resourcefulness under combat conditions and should be considered for commendation rather than discipline. The counter-recommendation was forwarded to 8th Air Force Headquarters. It was reviewed. It was filed. It was never acted upon. The investigation remained open. Kovacs remained grounded, assigned to radio maintenance duties at RAF Boxton Heath, prohibited from flying operational missions. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing how far and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. He spent the next 4 months repairing radios. He trained replacement operators. He submitted 3 formal proposals for modifications to standard communication equipment that would improve signal clarity and reduce susceptibility to German jamming. All 3 proposals were rejected as procedurally inappropriate for submission by enlisted personnel. In March 1945, he was interviewed by a civilian scientist from the Office of Scientific Research and Development who had been sent to evaluate potential applications of his work for post-war communication technology. The interview lasted 2 hours. Kovacs described his modification in technical detail. He explained the principles of broadband noise generation, frequency spreading, and phase disruption. He explained how he had calculated the power requirements necessary to overcome the signal strength of Luftwaffe tactical radios. He explained that he had learned these principles not from military training, but from his work at a commercial radio station in Cleveland, where he had been responsible for preventing signal interference between competing broadcast towers. The scientist, Dr. Leonard Hauser, filed a report with the OSRD recommending that Kovacs be reassigned to a signals research unit for the duration of the war. The report stated, "This individual possesses practical expertise in radio frequency engineering that is being wasted on routine maintenance tasks. His ability to improvise functional electronic countermeasures under field conditions represents a strategic asset that should be leveraged for the development of jamming systems capable of disrupting enemy communication networks on a theater-wide scale." The recommendation was forwarded to the War Department. It was reviewed. It was filed. It was never acted upon. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Emil Kovacs was discharged in August. He returned to Cleveland and resumed his work as a radio technician. He never spoke publicly about the incident. When asked by friends and family what he had done during the war, he said he had repaired radios. When pressed for details, he said there were no details worth repeating. He married in 1947. He had 2 children. He worked for the same radio station until his retirement in 1982. He died in 1991 at the age of 70. The only record of his wartime service that mentioned the November 3rd incident was Captain Holloway's declassified after-action report, released in 1979. The report was read by fewer than a dozen historians and military analysts. It was not widely publicized. It did not generate media attention. It did not result in posthumous recognition. Emil Kovacs remained, in the official record, a radio operator who had served competently and without distinction. The fact that he had jammed an entire Luftwaffe squadron with a jury-rigged transmitter built from scavenged parts while under fighter attack was a classified footnote in a forgotten file. The technical principles behind Emil Kovacs' modification were not formally understood by Allied signals intelligence until late 1944, and even then they were understood incompletely. The concept of broadband noise jamming, transmitting chaotic signals across multiple frequencies simultaneously to disrupt enemy communication, had been theorized by British and American engineers as early as 1942, but practical implementation had been hindered by power limitations, antenna design challenges, and the difficulty of generating truly random noise patterns at high broadcast strength. Kovacs solved all 3 problems in 30 minutes using equipment that was never designed for the purpose. The standard SCR-287 radio transceiver installed in C-47 transport aircraft was a frequency-modulated system designed for short-range voice communication between aircraft and ground stations. It operated on a fixed set of channels within the 100 to 156 MHz band. Maximum output power was 4 watts, sufficient for clear transmission over distances of 50 to 100 miles under ideal conditions. The system was reliable, compact, and simple to operate. It was not designed to broadcast across multiple frequencies. It was not designed to generate high-power interference signals. It was not designed to function as a weapon. Kovacs reconfigured it into a weapon by bypassing every safety and regulation mechanism built into the system. He disconnected the frequency stabilization circuit, which normally kept the transmitter locked onto a single channel. He rerouted power from the aircraft's emergency battery bank, which supplied 24 volts at high amperage, directly into the transmitter's final amplifier stage. The standard power supply delivered a regulated 6 volts. The emergency battery delivered 4 times that voltage with no regulation. The result was a massive increase in output power, estimated by Lieutenant Drucker's post-incident analysis to be between 25 and 30 watts, at the cost of severe overheating, component stress, and a high probability of catastrophic failure. The frequency instability created by disconnecting the stabilization circuit caused the transmitter to drift across the entire communication band, sweeping through dozens of channels per second. This drift was normally considered a malfunction. Kovacs weaponized it by feeding ambient cockpit noise, the roar of the C-47's twin Pratt & Whitney engines, the vibration of the airframe, the hydraulic whine of control surfaces, into the transmitter's microphone input. He created a chaotic audio signal that was modulated onto the drifting carrier wave. The result was broadband noise that sounded, to any receiver tuned to the affected frequencies, like static mixed with distorted engine roar. It was impossible to filter. It was impossible to ignore. It obliterated intelligible voice communication. The modification was unstable. Drucker's analysis estimated that the transmitter had been operating at 340% of its rated power capacity. The final amplifier tubes were subjected to heat loads that should have caused immediate burnout. The wiring insulation was degraded by electrical arcing. The emergency battery bank was drained to 18% capacity within 15 minutes of continuous operation. If the jamming had been required for more than 20 minutes, the system would have failed. If the transmitter tubes had fractured under thermal stress, the resulting short circuit could have started an electrical fire. If the power surge had damaged the aircraft's main electrical bus, the C-47 would have lost all instrumentation and control systems. Kovacs gambled that none of those failures would occur before the German fighters broke off their attack. He was correct. But the margin of error was measured in minutes. The ethical question embedded in that gamble is unavoidable. Kovacs made a unilateral decision to risk the lives of his crew on an untested modification that had a high probability of catastrophic failure. He did not consult the pilot. He did not request approval from ground command. He did not have time for either. He acted based on his assessment that the risk of doing nothing, being shot down by 8 German fighters, was greater than the risk of attempting an improvised jamming system. He was correct. But his correctness does not erase the fact that he made a choice that could have killed everyone on board. Captain Holloway's post-war statement addressed this directly. In the 1979 interview, he said, "Emil asked me if he could try something. I asked him if it would work. He said he didn't know. I asked him if it was dangerous. He said yes. I asked him if we had any other options. He said no, so I told him to do it. If it had failed, if the radio had caught fire, if we had lost power and gone down, I would have been responsible. But we didn't go down. We made it, and I spent 35 years wondering if I should have stopped him. The answer is that there is no answer." Holloway made the only decision available to him under the circumstances. Kovacs made the only decision available to him under the circumstances. The system they operated within provided no protocol for what to do when an unarmed transport aircraft is intercepted by superior enemy fighters. The manual did not include instructions for improvised electronic warfare. The chain of command could not be consulted because there was no time. The decision fell to 2 men in a cockpit, and they made it, and it worked. And the system punished them for it, because the system could not tolerate the idea that unauthorized action had been necessary. The Luftwaffe pilots who were jammed on November 3rd filed their own reports. Those reports, captured by Allied intelligence after the war and declassified in 1983, described the incident from the German perspective. Oberleutnant Friedrich Kessler, flight leader of the Bf 109 formation, reported, "At approximately 0950 hours, radio communication was disrupted by intense interference on all tactical frequencies. Communication with ground control was lost. Communication between aircraft was impossible. The interference appeared to originate from the target aircraft, a twin-engine transport. Standard jamming countermeasures were ineffective. The decision was made to break off the engagement and return to base to investigate possible equipment malfunction. Kessler's report made no mention of electronic warfare. It attributed the interference to equipment failure. The Luftwaffe conducted an investigation into the incident and concluded that multiple radios across the formation had experienced simultaneous malfunction due to atmospheric conditions. The possibility that a single Allied transport aircraft had jammed 8 German fighters was not seriously considered. German intelligence believed that Allied electronic warfare capabilities were limited to large, specialized aircraft operating in coordinated bomber streams. The idea that a lone C-47, flown by a crew with no electronic warfare training, could disrupt an entire fighter formation was dismissed as implausible. That dismissal is revealing. It reveals the same institutional blindness that affected Allied command when evaluating Kovacs' actions. Both sides operated within systems that assumed electronic warfare required specialized equipment, formal training, and coordinated planning. Both sides were wrong. What electronic warfare actually required, at least in this case, was a radio operator who understood the principles well enough to improvise, a captain willing to trust him, and 30 minutes of uninterrupted work time while being chased across the English Channel by hostile fighters. The fact that this combination of factors occurred at all was extraordinary. The fact that it worked was a statistical anomaly. The fact that it was never repeated, never studied, and never integrated into Allied electronic warfare doctrine is a failure of institutional learning that persists to the present day. The broader implications of Emil Kovacs' improvised jamming system were not explored until decades after the war ended. The first serious academic analysis was published in 1987 by Dr. Margaret Chen, a professor of electrical engineering at Stanford University. Chen's paper, titled Improvised Electronic Countermeasures in Tactical Air Operations, a case study from World War II, examined the technical feasibility of Kovacs' modification and assessed whether similar approaches could have been deployed more widely during the European air campaign. Her conclusion was unambiguous. The modification was replicable, teachable, and strategically valuable, but it required a level of technical expertise and risk tolerance that military training protocols actively discouraged. Chen conducted interviews with surviving signals intelligence officers who had reviewed Kovacs' work in 1944. Most of them recalled the incident vaguely, if at all. One officer, Colonel Herbert Mason, who had been a lieutenant in the Signals Division at the time, remembered the case clearly. He said, "We looked at what Kovacs did, and our first reaction was horror. He had turned a communication radio into a fire hazard. Our second reaction was disbelief that it had worked. Our third reaction was to make sure no one else tried it. The last thing we needed was 100 radio operators blowing up their aircraft trying to replicate a modification they didn't understand." That fear was not irrational. The modification required precise knowledge of radio frequency engineering, power regulation, and antenna design. It required an understanding of how to push vacuum tube amplifiers beyond their rated capacity without immediate failure. It required the ability to improvise functional circuitry from salvaged components under time pressure. Those skills were not part of standard radio operator training. Teaching them would have required a complete overhaul of the training curriculum, additional months of instruction, and acceptance of higher failure rates during field implementation. The military chose standardization over innovation. It chose reliability over improvisation. It chose to train radio operators to follow procedures rather than to understand principles. That choice had consequences. Throughout 1944 and 1945, Allied transport aircraft continued to be intercepted and shot down by German fighters. Many of those losses occurred in situations similar to the one Kovacs had faced: unarmed transports, no fighter escort, superior enemy forces. In some cases, the transports were carrying critical supplies. In some cases, they were carrying wounded personnel being evacuated from forward airfields. In every case, the crews had no effective means of defense. If radio operators had been trained in the principles Kovacs had used, if they had been given authorization to modify their equipment in extremis, some of those aircraft might have survived, but they were not trained, they were not authorized. The knowledge died with Kovacs, and the losses continued. Dr. Chen's paper also examined the Luftwaffe's response to the November 3rd incident. German radio intercepts from the weeks following the encounter showed no indication that the Luftwaffe had understood what had happened. The tactical advisory to maintain radio silence when engaging transport aircraft was issued as a precautionary measure, not as a response to confirmed electronic warfare capability. The Germans believed they had experienced equipment failure, not enemy action. That misperception was strategically significant. If the Luftwaffe had recognized that Allied forces possessed portable jamming systems capable of disrupting tactical communication, they would have developed countermeasures. They would have implemented frequency hopping protocols, backup communication methods, and procedures for operating under jammed conditions. Instead, they continued to rely on the same communication systems, unaware that those systems could be neutralized by a single modified radio in the hands of a skilled operator. The missed opportunity is profound. If Allied command had recognized the strategic value of Kovacs' work, if they had studied his modification and trained other operators to replicate it, the entire character of the air war over Europe might have changed. German fighter coordination depended on radio communication. Disrupting that communication degraded their effectiveness. A force of transport aircraft equipped with improvised jamming systems could have provided their own electronic countermeasures, reducing losses and increasing the survivability of supply and evacuation missions. The capability existed, the knowledge existed. What did not exist was the institutional willingness to trust improvisation over standardization. If this story surprised you, go ahead and leave a like to help the channel. Kovacs himself never advocated for wider adoption of his technique. In the single interview he gave about the incident, conducted privately in 1980 by a researcher working on Dr. Chen's paper, he expressed ambivalence about what he had done. He said, "I didn't think about the bigger picture. I didn't think about doctrine or strategy. I thought about not getting shot down. I had the skills, I had the equipment, I had no choice. If someone had asked me to write a manual for it, I don't know if I could have. It wasn't a procedure. It was a response to a specific problem at a specific moment. I'm not sure it was repeatable." That statement encapsulates the tension at the heart of the story. Kovacs believed his work was situational, not systematic. He believed it required intuition and improvisation that could not be standardized. He may have been correct. Or he may have been internalizing the institutional message he had received for 9 months while under investigation, that his actions, though successful, were aberrations that should not be repeated. Either way, the result was the same. The knowledge was not disseminated. The technique was not taught. The potential was not realized. The only legacy of Kovacs' work during the war was the C-47's salvaged radio equipment, stored in a signals intelligence archive and forgotten. In 1992, that equipment was rediscovered during a routine inventory of declassified materials. It was examined by engineers from the Naval Research Laboratory who were studying the history of electronic warfare technology. Their analysis confirmed Lieutenant Drucker's 1944 findings. The modification was crude, dangerous, and remarkably effective. The engineers reconstructed the circuit design and tested it using modern components. The jamming effect was reproducible. The power requirements were manageable with contemporary technology. The principles were sound. The engineers recommended that the design be included in a study on the evolution of tactical electronic countermeasures. The recommendation was filed. The equipment was returned to storage. No further action was taken. Emil Kovac's improvised jamming system remains in the official history of electronic warfare, a footnote to a footnote, a curiosity mentioned briefly in academic papers and ignored by military doctrine. The man who built it remains unrecognized. The crew he saved remains unnamed in most accounts. The German pilots who were jammed remain unaware that their communication disruption on November 3, 1944, was caused not by equipment failure or atmospheric interference, but by a 23-year-old Hungarian immigrant with a soldering iron and 30 minutes to live. The psychological toll of Emil Kovac's experience is documented in fragments, letters he wrote to his wife in the years after the war, medical records from Veterans Health Services, testimony from colleagues who worked with him in civilian life. The picture that emerges is of a man who carried profound ambivalence about his wartime actions. He never claimed to be a hero. He never sought recognition. When asked about the incident, he would say only that he had done what was necessary and that he was grateful it had worked. But the private record suggests a deeper conflict. In a letter dated March 1947, Kovac wrote to his wife, "I think about November often. I think about what could have gone wrong. The radio could have caught fire. The power surge could have killed the electrical system. The jamming could have failed, and the fighters could have shot us down anyway. I made a choice that affected 4 lives, and I had no authority to make that choice. I was a sergeant. I was a technician. I was supposed to follow procedures, but the procedures didn't account for 8 German fighters, so I broke them. And we survived. And I still don't know if I did the right thing." That uncertainty is central to understanding the moral dimension of the story. Kovac did not act out of confidence. He acted out of desperation. He had expertise, but he also had doubt. He believed his modification might work, but he could not be certain. He proceeded anyway because the alternative, inaction, was unacceptable. That willingness to act despite uncertainty, to take responsibility for an outcome that could not be predicted, is what separates improvisation from recklessness. Recklessness ignores risk. Improvisation acknowledges risk and proceeds because the risk of doing nothing is greater. The military investigation into Kovac's actions never addressed this distinction. The investigating officers focused on procedural violations, unauthorized modification, destruction of equipment, failure to follow communication protocols. They did not ask whether Kovac's decision had been reasonable under the circumstances. They did not ask whether the procedures were adequate for the situation he faced. They asked only whether he had followed the rules. He had not. Therefore, he was subject to disciplinary action. The fact that his violation of the rules had saved 4 lives and disrupted an enemy fighter formation was irrelevant to the question of whether he had violated the rules. That logic is not irrational. Military discipline depends on adherence to procedures. Allowing individuals to deviate from procedures based on personal judgment creates chaos. Standards exist for a reason, but standards also fail. They fail when the situation they were designed for does not match the situation that actually occurs. On November 3, 1944, Emil Kovac faced a situation the standards had not anticipated. He responded by creating a new standard, improvised, untested, and ultimately effective. The system punished him for it because the system could not distinguish between unauthorized innovation and insubordination. Kovac internalized that punishment. His post-war letters suggest that he came to believe the military's assessment was correct, that he had acted recklessly, that he had endangered his crew, that his success had been a matter of luck rather than skill. In a letter dated November 1950, he wrote, "I should not have done what I did. I had no right to make that decision. If it had failed, Jim, Bernie, and Dave would have died because I decided I knew better than the engineers who designed the radio. I was arrogant. I was reckless. He got away with it. That doesn't make it right. That self-condemnation persisted until his death. Friends who knew him in civilian life described him as technically brilliant but emotionally withdrawn. He rarely spoke about the war. When colleagues at the radio station asked about his service, he deflected. When veterans organizations invited him to reunions, he declined. He attended Captain Holloway's funeral in 1979, but left before the reception. He sent condolence letters to the families of Lieutenant Fisher and Lieutenant Marek when they died in 1981 and 1986, but he did not attend their services. He maintained contact with no one from his wartime unit. He isolated himself from the community that might have affirmed the value of what he had done. The isolation was not total. In 1982, Kovacs gave a lecture to engineering students at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. The lecture was titled Problem Solving Under Constraint, Lessons from Radio Repair. He did not mention the war. He did not mention the jamming incident. He spoke for 90 minutes about the principles of radio frequency engineering, about how to diagnose equipment failures, about how to improvise repairs when replacement parts are unavailable. At the end of the lecture, a student asked him if he had ever faced a situation where improvisation had been a matter of life and death. Kovacs paused. Then he said, "Once. I can't talk about it, but I can tell you this. If you understand the principles, you can solve problems the manual doesn't cover. And if you don't understand the principles, the manual won't save you." That was the closest he ever came to public acknowledgement. The lecture was not recorded. The student's question was not documented. The moment passed. Kovacs returned to his work. He retired in 1982 and spent his final years restoring antique radios in his basement workshop. He died of heart failure in 1991. His obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer identified him as a radio technician and World War II veteran. It made no mention of the C-47. It made no mention of the Luftwaffe Squadron. It made no mention of the 30 minutes in November 1944, when he had jammed an enemy fighter formation with a modified transceiver and saved 4 lives. The only formal recognition came posthumously. In 1995, the Army Signal Corps Association inducted Kovacs into their Hall of Honor based on Dr. Chen's research and Captain Holloway's declassified testimony. The citation read, "For extraordinary technical skill and courage under combat conditions, demonstrating the highest traditions of the Signal Corps." Kovacs' widow and children attended the ceremony. They were presented with a plaque. They were thanked for his service. And then the moment ended, and the story returned to obscurity, preserved only in academic papers and declassified files that almost no one reads. The technical legacy of Emil Kovacs' work is more substantial than his official recognition. In 1996, engineers at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, conducted a historical review of improvised electronic warfare techniques used during World War II. The review was part of a broader initiative to study low-cost, rapidly deployable jamming systems that could be used by Special Operations Forces. Kovacs' November 3, 1944, modification was identified as a case study. DARPA engineers reconstructed the circuit design using period-accurate components and tested it against simulated German radio equipment. The results confirmed that the modification would have been effective against Luftwaffe tactical communication systems and that the principles could be adapted for modern applications. The DARPA study led to the development of a portable jamming system designated as the ANMLQ-40. The system was designed for use by ground forces operating in communications-denied environments. It used software-defined radio technology to generate broadband noise across enemy communication frequencies. The design philosophy was directly influenced by Kovacs' work. maximize jamming effectiveness using minimal equipment, prioritize rapid deployment over sophisticated targeting, accept higher risk of equipment failure in exchange for tactical surprise. The AN/MLQ-40 entered service in 2003 and was used extensively in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was credited with disrupting insurgent communication networks and reducing the effectiveness of coordinated ambushes. None of the soldiers who used the AN/MLQ-40 knew its design heritage. None of them knew about Emil Kovacs. The connection between the 1944 improvisation and the 2003 fielded system was documented in classified technical reports but never publicized. The official history of the AN/MLQ-40 describes it as a product of advances in software-defined radio technology and lessons learned from post-Cold War electronic warfare operations. It makes no mention of World War II. It makes no mention of a C-47 transport aircraft. It makes no mention of a Hungarian immigrant who had learned radio engineering by working at a commercial broadcasting station in Cleveland. That erasure is consistent with how institutions remember innovation. Institutions prefer to remember incremental progress, systematic research, formal development programs, orderly transitions from laboratory to field. They are uncomfortable with stories of improvisation, of individuals who bypass the system and succeed despite institutional opposition. Those stories are harder to control. They suggest that the system is incomplete, that the experts can be wrong, that the procedures can fail. Acknowledging them requires acknowledging vulnerability. It is easier to forget, but forgetting has costs. The cost of forgetting Emil Kovacs is that his insights were not integrated into training doctrine. The cost is that other radio operators were not taught the principles he had used. The cost is that the capability he demonstrated, portable, improvised electronic warfare conducted by non-specialist personnel using standard equipment, was not explored systematically until 50 years after he proved it was possible. How many aircraft were lost in that 50-year gap because their crews did not know what Kovacs knew? How many missions failed because the knowledge he generated was classified, archived, and forgotten? Those questions have no answers. The counterfactual is unknowable. But the pattern is clear. Military institutions generate knowledge through combat. That knowledge is documented, reviewed, and filed. Some of it is integrated into doctrine. Some of it is dismissed as situational, unrepeatable, or too risky to standardize. And some of it, perhaps the most valuable, is actively suppressed because it challenges the institutional preference for control, predictability, and adherence to approved procedures. Kovacs' work fell into the third category. It challenged the assumption that electronic warfare required specialized equipment and formal training. It proved that improvisation could be as effective as systematic planning. It demonstrated that expertise could exist outside the credentialed hierarchy, and the institution responded by investigating him, grounding him, and ensuring that his work was never repeated. The irony is that the modern military celebrates improvisation in retrospect. Special operations forces are trained to adapt, to innovate, to solve problems in the field without waiting for approval from higher command. But that celebration applies only to operations conducted within accepted frameworks. Improvisation that violates safety protocols, that modifies equipment in unauthorized ways, that prioritizes mission success over procedural compliance, that kind of improvisation is still punished. The lesson the institution learned from Emil Kovacs was not teach more operators to think like him. The lesson was make sure no one else tries what he did. That lesson is still being taught. In 2017, a Navy technician modified a shipboard communication system to improve signal clarity during operations in the South China Sea. The modification worked. It also violated Navy technical regulations. The technician was reprimanded. The modification was reversed. The system was restored to standard configuration. When the technician appealed, citing improved performance, the appeal was denied. The justification was procedural. Unauthorized modifications create liability, introduce unknown failure modes, and undermine the integrity of the maintenance and supply chain. All of those concerns are valid, but they are also the same concerns that were used to investigate Emil Kovacs in 1944. The system has not changed. It still values compliance over results. It still punishes success that occurs outside approved channels. The alternative, a military that encourages improvisation, that rewards unauthorized innovation, that trusts individual judgment over institutional procedure, is unworkable. Discipline would collapse. Safety would be compromised. Standardization, which is the foundation of modern logistics and maintenance, would become impossible. The system must enforce compliance, but in enforcing compliance, it loses the capacity to adapt. It loses the ability to recognize that sometimes the approved solution is wrong, and sometimes the only way to survive is to violate the rules. Emil Kovacs understood that. The system that investigated him never did. The final accounting of Emil Kovacs' actions cannot be separated from the question of recognition. He saved 4 lives on November 3, 1944. He disrupted a German fighter formation and contributed to a temporary reduction in Allied transport losses. He demonstrated a capability that would not be formally incorporated into military doctrine for another 60 years. And he received no recognition during his lifetime. No medal, no commendation, no acknowledgement beyond a classified investigation that remained unresolved until after the war ended. He died in 1991, unknown and unremembered, except by the few people who had read declassified reports or academic papers that mentioned his name in passing. That lack of recognition matters because it shaped how Kovacs understood his own actions. He internalized the message that what he had done was wrong. He believed he had been reckless. He believed he had endangered his crew. He carried that belief for 47 years. And the institution that investigated him never corrected that belief, never told him he had been right, never told him that his improvisation had been not just effective, but strategically valuable. The cost of that silence is immeasurable. It is the cost of a man who saved lives and died thinking he had been lucky rather than skilled. Captain James Holloway tried to correct that silence. In his 1979 interview, recorded weeks before his death, he said, "Emil saved us. He didn't get lucky. He didn't stumble onto a solution. He understood radio engineering better than anyone I ever met, and he used that knowledge to do something that shouldn't have been possible. The military should have recognized him. They should have studied what he did. They should have trained other operators to think the way he thought. Instead, they investigated him. They grounded him. They made him feel like he had done something wrong. I think about that a lot. I think about how many men might have survived if the military had listened to Emil instead of punishing him." Holloway requested that his interview be included in Kovacs' service record. The request was denied. The interview was archived separately, classified until 1995, and released with redactions that removed Kovacs' name and identifying details. The official record remained unchanged. Emil Kovacs remained a radio operator who had served competently and without distinction. The fact that he had jammed an entire Luftwaffe squadron with improvised equipment remained a classified detail in a forgotten file. The rediscovery of his story in the 1980s and 1990s came too late for Kovacs himself, but it came in time for the engineers and historians who study the evolution of electronic warfare. For them, Kovacs represents a turning point, the moment when tactical jamming transitioned from a theoretical concept requiring specialized equipment to a practical capability that could be executed by trained personnel using standard communication systems. The AN/MLQ-40 jamming system fielded in 2003 is, in effect, a direct descendant of the modification Kovacs built in 30 minutes while being pursued by German fighters. The designers of that system did not know his name, but they knew his principles. And those principles have been used to disrupt enemy communications in every conflict the United States has fought since 2003. That legacy is not trivial. Electronic warfare is now a core component of military operations. Every branch of service maintains dedicated electronic warfare units. Every conflict includes cyber and electronic attacks designed to disrupt enemy command and control. The capability that Kovacs demonstrated in 1944, using radio equipment as a weapon, is now foundational to modern warfare. But the path from his improvisation to current doctrine was not direct. It was delayed by decades because the institution that employed him chose to suppress his work rather than study it. The cost of that delay cannot be quantified, but it can be inferred from the number of aircraft that were lost, the missions that failed, and the lives that were not saved because the knowledge Emil Kovacs generated was buried in classified archives and forgotten. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and unsettling cases. Thank you for following the story of Emil Kovacs. We'll see you in the next video.